Tony was determined he was going to go to America, and he just needed to find a way, but he wasn't having much success, if you recall. But 10 days after Tony contacted a shipping office, he received a one-line message from the ship's captain. One passenger who was to leave tomorrow on the ship to America is ill and cannot go. I will go, Tony exclaimed. He hurried to get his passport and to borrow money for his ticket. He packed his belongings and said goodbye to his family. That very day, he traveled by train to Naples, Italy, where he would begin his journey across the ocean to America. He raced up the gangplank of the huge ship, a suitcase in each hand and $30 American in his pocket. His heartbeat quickened when the deep-throated whistle announced the ship's departure from the harbor. Anthony Rossi was on his way to America, and how long the trip took from Naples, Italy to New York City. As the ocean liner finally approached America, Tony stood on the deck, his eyes scanning the coastline. There she is, cried Tony, the Statue of Liberty. Other ships and smaller crafts carved white lines of foam in the harbor's busy waters. Tony felt the excitement surge inside him as he watched businessmen, travelers from foreign lands, and important-looking officers hurrying to and fro on the ship. 21-year-old Tony could hardly wait for the ship to dock. He was ready to tackle anything, even though he could only say please, yes, no, and I am hungry in English. Good thing he knew that one, right? Tony found the train station with no problem. Uncle Constantino had given him directions to the home of an Italian family in New York City. They were my friends, he had assured Tony. They will be your friends too. Once on the train, Tony double-checked the directions and realized he needed help. Please, Bleecker Street, he asked the conductor on the train. I'll tell you when to get off, the conductor assured him. Alone on the train, Tony could not talk with those around him. He could not understand what they were saying. So he thought, when I get off at Bleecker Street, will I find Thompson Street? Will Uncle's friends really be friendly? How long will it take me to find a job? My $30 won't last long. The train clicked past homes and street signs and then rounded a large curve. The signs confused Tony. The view through his window did not match his uncle's directions. He stepped up to the conductor again. Please, Bleecker Street? The conductor impatiently waved his arms and gestured that they had passed Bleecker Street. Get off at the next stop, go back, 2 stops back. Tony got off at the next stop and looked around to see where he could catch the train going in the opposite direction. Whom should he meet but an Italian shoeshine boy? What a relief to talk Italian and get directions. Riding in the opposite direction, Tony found Bleecker Street. With his 2 suitcases in his hands and his head high, Tony walked confidently away from the train station. Ahead of him was a signpost, and it read, Thompson Street. What a welcome Tony received. The warm hubbub of Italian voices assured Tony he was among friends. Yes, we know of your father, one of Uncle's friends cried. Another added, there is a job for you at our uncle's machine shop not far away. We will send someone along with you to make arrangements. Tony met the mechanic that afternoon. You will hand me tools when I need them, help me with construction projects, and learn my trade, the mechanic told him. Be here at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, young man. Now, Tony needed a place to stay, but his new friends had arranged for that. Tony, there is an Italian family on West Broadway. They have an apartment on the 6th floor. They say there's room for you to board there. After only a few hours in America, Tony had a job, a place to stay, and friends. New York winters were bitterly cold. Tony shivered under his sheets as the alarm clock clanged. He watched the key unwind on the clock, then jumped out of bed. His bare feet hit the icy floor boards. Brr, he exclaimed, dressing quickly. Sure wish I could have a pot of hot chicken soup all cooked and ready when I come home tonight. Tony hurried to the kitchen to prepare his breakfast. As he turned on the gas stove, an idea entered his mind. Excitedly, he went to his bedroom, grabbed his alarm clock, and returned to the stove. Getting some string, he tied the legs of the alarm to the left burner on the stove. Then he tied a cord to the wind-up key on the clock. Taking the other end of the cord, he fastened it to the stove handle. Tony lit the gas, turned on the stove, and then set off the alarm to test his invention. Sure enough, the clock spun the cord around its wind-up key so the stove handle slowly but surely was pulled into the off position. A fresh chicken, water, salt, an onion, some vegetables. Tony listed the ingredients as he placed them in a pan. Now, the soup will have to cook for about 3 hours, he decided as he set the alarm. When I come home tonight, I'll only have to heat the soup. Tony laughed as he left his apartment and ran down the 6 flights of steps. Tony's next challenge was driving a taxi cab. After only 6 months in the United States, he bought his own car. Soon he left his job in the machine shop. Driving through New York City one day, Tony thought, taxi driving is great, but with another kind of car, I could become a chauffeur. That might be even better. Tony took his savings and bought a bigger car, then began looking for someone who needed a chauffeur. Tony rapped firmly on Mr. Root's door. Wealthy and the owner of a grand home, Mr. Root had a reputation for being stuffy and proud. He would not read a newspaper without wearing gloves. He spoke to others only when he could not avoid it. But Mr. Root needed a chauffeur, and Tony applied in person. He would not be bullied by Mr. Root's haughtiness. Mr. Root looked down his nose at Tony. How much do you charge per month for your car and your services? Without blinking an eye, Tony stated, $450 a month, sir. Only a year ago, Tony had been earning just $140 a month at the machine shop. Well, that's rather much, don't you think? Mr. Root's eyebrows shot up. Tony didn't respond. I tell you, young man, $450 is a lot of money. Think it over and telephone me if you change your mind. Yes, Tony answered seriously. Mr. Root sensed Tony would not call with a lower price. I will phone you if I decide it is a deal, he stated. When Tony reached his apartment, the phone was ringing. Mr. Root had made his decision. Meet me at my home at 1:15 sharp, he barked into the phone. Tony began his new job enthusiastically. Mr. Root never spoke to him as they drove. He rang a bell once for Tony to stop the car. 2 rings meant turn right. 3 rings meant turn left. With no one to talk to, Tony had time to think, and lots of ideas were brewing in Brabanti's mind. Why not take a part-time job too? Tony asked himself. So he collected eggs in the country and sold them door to door in the city. When Tony's brother Joe arrived from Italy, they opened a grocery store and advertised their specialty, Aurora Farms, eggs only 1 day old. Aurora Farms became popular. Tony had a knack for remembering prices, getting along with his customers, and finding the best deals. Even though it was Depression times in the late 1920s and many stores had closed, Aurora Farms grew. One day, a man came to the store and offered Tony $30,000 for the store and all the groceries. Tony thought, I've enjoyed Aurora Farms, but I've always wanted to try the restaurant business, so he sold the store. About a year after opening his first restaurant, Tony noticed that his old store had closed. What happened? He asked a person he met on the street near the store. Just gave up, they did. Store didn't do well, so they left, the man replied before walking on. Tony remembered his happy days at Aurora Farms and made another split-second decision. He turned to his brother, Joe. I'm leaving the restaurant in your hands, and I'm going back to Aurora Farms. Once again, the store became popular. Tony's old customers were thrilled to have him back in the neighborhood, and Tony enjoyed meeting new customers, too. There was a young lady who shopped regularly at the store. To Tony, whenever she entered the store, it was as if all the other customers disappeared. I've never met anyone like her before, Tony marveled. His rascally mind began working. I wonder how I can get to know her. Tony stood beside the cash register, staring into space. Suddenly, he looked up to see Florence Stark standing at the counter with her groceries. Her eyes were smiling. May I leave these groceries here, she asked. I need to go to the butcher's shop, so I'll pick them up when I come back. Why, certainly, Tony stammered. While Florence bought her meat, Brabanti hurried around the store. He hunted until he found several large jars of jelly. Then he put them in the bottom of the bag containing Florence's groceries. He smiled to himself. She won't be able to lift this box now, he reasoned. When Florence returned, she was startled to find the bag so heavy. I didn't think I bought so much, she said with surprise. Never mind, Miss Stark, Tony replied, hoping he looked cool and casual. I will have them sent to your apartment. Why, thank you, Florence exclaimed. I appreciate your service very, very much. Later, who should deliver the bag of groceries to Florence's apartment but Tony himself. Soon Tony and Florence realized how much they liked each other. Tony proposed and Florence accepted. When the months of their long engagement were over, Tony was ecstatic. He had married the woman he loved. He was still in his 30s, and he had one of the most successful grocery stores in New York City. One day, however, Tony asked Florence, "Have you ever been to Florida?" By now, Florence had learned that a tiny bit of young Brabante, the rascal boy, lived on in her hard-working husband. Tony never stopped dreaming. If we go south, he continued, I think I would like to try farming. What kind of farming? She asked, mystified. I don't know exactly. I think I will go to the library and find out about agriculture in the South, especially in Florida. Tony was so committed to his new adventure that he sold the store. With his free time, he prepared to move south. He loved to visit the New York City Public Library and was fascinated by what he discovered there about growing tomatoes. He took a book to a long wooden table and sat to read. Someone before him had left a book on the table. Tony glanced at it, and the title captured his interest. The Life of Christ, Tony said to himself. I don't know anything about Christ except what I learned as a child at Christmas and Easter times. He opened the book and began to read. He couldn't put the book down. On and on he read, forgetting all about his book on tomato farming. The story of Jesus' life unfolded as Tony read. Hours passed. Tony looked at his watch. He'd read through lunchtime. Quickly he ran out to get a sandwich. Then he hurried back to the library to read more. As the late afternoon sun began streaming in the windows and library workers began tidying up for closing time, Tony realized that he had read for the entire day. This is wonderful, he thought as he closed the book and stretched, but now why don't I go to the source? Tomorrow I'll come back and find a Bible to read. Tony returned the next day and the next. He read of God's power in creating the world. How great a God to create his vast universe, thought Tony as he remembered the astronomy book he had read years ago. He continued reading about God's faithfulness and fairness with his people in the Old Testament, but was so excited to move on to the New Testament that he began skipping sections. Finally, he sighed. The first book of the New Testament on the life of Christ. Tony was not disappointed. The miracles of Jesus, his wise teaching, his death on the cross, and the way he came to life again impressed Tony greatly. Then he read the words of John 3:16. Say it with me. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Suddenly, all the questions Tony had about God over the years were answered. Here it is, he cried to himself. Christ has already died to pay for all of my sins. He will forgive each person who trusts him. The library was very quiet as Tony pondered what he had read. He knew God was real, and now he understood that all he needed to do was believe that Jesus had died for his sin. He bowed his head. In the silence surrounding him, God seemed very near. God, you know that I've always been the rascal boy. Even now I put my work and myself first. Thank you for giving your Son to be punished for my sin. I want you to be my Savior. I want to put you first now, ahead of my work, ahead of dear Florence, and ahead of myself. Tony left the library with a smile on his face. He hurried home to tell Florence what he had done. I wonder how following Jesus will change my big plans for success, Tony thought. We'll stop there.